positive number, right? This is a positive number. It implies that corruption is going down when the country is engaging into a trade. When the country is engaging into a trade, the corruption is going down. But the significance level is not there. It's statistically not significant. So it's a very weak effect. Okay? It's a very weak effect. When I change this from trade openness to PTA, the PTA dummy suggests that there is, if we look at the estimated coefficient, is always negative. This implies that with entering into a preferential trade agreement, corruption is going up. Corruption is going up, which is very counterintuitive. Why? Because we would imagine that corruption should go down when you are entering into a preferential trade agreement. But instead, in our results, we are finding that corruption is increasing when you are engaging into a preferential trade agreement. What is a preferential trade agreement again? NAFTA, North America Free Trade Association, okay? US, Canada, and Mexico. Now, this is a counterintuitive finding. We need to explain this one, why this finding is as such. My understanding is that, my intuitive interpretation is that, this is because we have told you that PTAs are originally from north and south. So this is happening because two third world countries are engaging into preferential trade agreement and they are not following the binding constraints. Which means that if Uganda and Burkina Faso, two sub-Saharan African countries, are getting into this PTA agreement, they are not following the PTA binding constraints, and it should reduce corruption, but it's counterintuitively enhancing corruption. Okay, so it's really like if you have the autocratic regimes, you will find this kind of a story. And to substantiate what we are saying, the next one, okay, as you can see, this is all the negatives. The next one is with all the developing nations, so all the third world country nations. And still, PTA dummy exhibits a negative relationship, which substantiates the story that I am telling, which means that there are two third world countries, and instead of reducing corruption, reducing domestic corruption, these third world countries and the governments out there, the respective governments, are actually promoting corruption. Okay? So this finding is very counterintuitive, and this finding is, I think this is really, it's actually opening a future research avenue. Okay, a future research avenue. So no significant association between trade openness and corruption. Results consistent for specifications. Okay, I'm not talking. It means trade openness is insignificant, whereas PTA dummy negative and significant, which means PTA is actually enhancing the domestic corruption. It enhancing the domestic corruption. So conclusion is that while trade itself can have a weak potential to mitigate corruption, trade agreements, however, can raise the same. Should be taken as a cautionary rather than an inevitable outcome of trade agreements, because our finding is again very counterintuitive. And if we say this is, you can generalize the finding, all we are saying is like, we are getting very anti-WTO or IMF or World Bank, which is not our intention at all. All we are trying to say is this is for the developing countries, not really for the developed countries. We have not identified the characteristics of trade agreements partners of a nation, which means we are assuming that, and that could be a future research avenue, that if we take US and Burkina Faso, US or Uganda, we will find a positive association instead of this negative association. Okay? This calls for further investigation. So we are writing the next paper on this while utilizing the developed countries and the underdeveloped countries as the two players in a preferential trade agreement. So this paper has been, it's really a review and resubmission in Journal of Applied Econometrics. And we got some very nice referee reports which can be, which is more possibly can be done. So I'm looking forward to it. Probably it will get published to Journal of, at the Journal of Applied Econometrics. Any suggestions?
I've got a question.
Yeah.
back up a slide?
Yeah.
Your last statement you were talking about developed nations, trade agreements with less developed nations. You're saying that in that case, you think that there will be a positive?
In that case, what we are seeing is like, or what we are assuming is like, we'll see that this preferential trade agreement would reduce the level of corruption, which means that there will be a positive association between the preferential trade agreement and the institutions of that country.
Okay. But only in that case? I mean,
only in that case. Otherwise, what's happening is like, if there are two underdeveloped countries, preferential trade agreement, instead of reducing corruption, is actually promoting corruption. You can think of two autocratic regimes in Africa. In Uganda, Idi Amin probably, in some other country, some other. What's happening is like, in that case, what they are doing, instead of reducing corruption, these regimes are acting in such a way that it increases corruption, the preferential trade agreement. But if we take the advanced countries, we are assuming that the results will change, and we will find that preferential trade agreement is actually reducing the political corruption. Yes?
What about the relationship between developed, BTAs between developed and developed countries?
Developed and developed. Now, that one would be interesting, but in that case, that's also something. I think while we are looking at with a developed and an underdeveloped, we can look at developed and developed. But I'm sure in that case you will find a very positive association. Yeah. So here we are not distinguishing between the developed and underdeveloped. So probably in general we are getting a negative association. But yes, we can do that.
That'd be a very interesting study, because that's how often used as a political tool. Trade agreements are.
Yes.
And while you may be effective on the one hand fighting one problem, you may be worsening the situation in terms of corruption.
Sure, sure. I guess in terms of, I'm sorry.
Well, go ahead.
In terms of, if you take US and Canada, the corruption level, the political corruption is very weak. Okay, and we know about the educated workers, so it's very easy to as well not to really make it very apparent. So in that case, I'm sure that you will find a good association, which means a very positive association with the institutions of a country and the preferential trade agreement.
You mentioned NAFTA, which of course would be
Yeah.
US and Canada, but what about the US and Mexico? In looking at that, is Mexico considered a developed or underdeveloped?
No, it's underdeveloped. This term I'm not very comfortable with. I would say it should be developing, probably.
Developing.
So yeah,
in the
it's
process.
increasing. Yeah, in the process.
Yeah. 'Cause I still think studying the US's preferential trade agreements with Canada, comparing those to those with Mexico, I would guess there still might be some
Big difference, because but still, I would imagine that US as a trading partner can enforce those binding constraints way better than some small country in Africa.
Sure.
So Mexico versus say Costa Rica and Mexico with US, the results would be very different, because US as a trading partner can impose the binding constraints way better than Costa Rica.
So the enforcing of all of the rules and constraints is the biggest issue of all of it then?
I'm sorry?
The ability to enforce all of the
Exactly.
constraints is the biggest issue of
Exactly.
all of it then?
That's why I said it's really the bureaucratic corruption, the ability to enforce the contracts. The contract enforcement is not there in the developing countries.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. Okay. And that's why we are looking at, and that's a very good suggestion, we are looking at developed and developed with developing. Let's see what are the results, subsamples of all these subsamples. Okay? Yes.
How about the number of participants in a particular agreement? Did you normalize for that, or
No.
were they just-
What we did is like, we took all the bilateral and multilateral, only three countries. So bilateral between US and Mexico, and multilateral like NAFTA, US, Mexico, and Canada. But not where you have the regional trade agreements, which means you have 4 or 5 countries,
Right.
or even higher probably. We are not considering that. Yes.
Your definition of the term institutions, is that political institutions or commercial?
No, they are the political institutions.
They are the political.
Yeah, and that's why I'm talking about here the political corruption or the bureaucratic corruption. There can be the commercial, like you suggested, financial corruption as well, but that's not being discussed here. Yeah.
Thanks.